Hello, everyone. My name is Luis J. Rodriguez. We're here at Tia Chucha Centro Cultural and Bookstore, which is here in the Silmore community of Los Angeles in the San Fernando Valley. We're so honored today to have a master writer, a pioneering Chicano writer, a professor, and we also have his colleague, Margarita Lopez. We have Alejandro Morales, and then Margarita Lopez. We're going to talk about the work of Alejandro Morales, but what we're going to do first is show this short film, The Brick People, which is based on a book that he wrote, a historical novel. It's a historical novel,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
It's a historical biographical novel.
Yeah, historical biographical novel that he wrote called The Brick People. And we're going to show the film, but let's introduce everybody and make sure everybody knows who's who. So I'm Luis Rodriguez, everybody knows who I am. Margarita.
I'll make my history a little brief. I'm also an immigrant, came here in the late 70s. So I was, first, I'm an immigrant that also worked in the fields in Santa Clarita. Then I went to Cal State Northridge here in the Valley, my education, my undergrad in engineering and also Spanish and Chicano studies. And then decided to become a professor, so I went to UC Irvine and did my studies. Actually, Alejandro was my mentor and graduated from there. I taught here in the Valley in several Cal States and retired in 2019, happily retired, and I'm working in some of the projects with Alejandro, editing.
My name is Alejandro Morales. I was born in 1944, just to get that clear, because I was born in Beverly Hospital in Montebello, and I was raised in Simon's Brickyard, and so that's how I lived there. They had a company town, and I lived there. I went to school there. I went to the segregated school there, Vale Elementary School, and went on to high school, and then went to East LA College for about a couple of years, transferred to Cal State LA, and by then I was married to Rhoda, my wife, which is right over there, and so we decided to quit our jobs. She was teaching, I was teaching at Claremont High School, she was teaching in Montebello Unified School District, and our parents were just getting in our way, right? They wanted us to buy a house, they wanted us to practically, run our lives. So Rhoda says, why don't you apply to schools back east? She's from Jamestown, Rhode Island. And so I did. I applied to Ivy League schools, a lot of good private schools and so forth. And then we discovered that we were going to have our first child. So we said, well, let's go to the school that gives us the most money. The heck with the prestige, but the one who can pay my way, or our way. And that's exactly what happened. And Rutgers University gave me just about a full ride for about 3-4 years. And all the while, I was still, I was writing, I was studying for the PhD. I wrote my dissertation in Mexico. I was there for about almost a year. I was the director of the Junior B. Abroad program, or assistant to the director. And I was in UNAM, in the Centro de Estudios Literarios in UNAM, which is really a wonderful place to be, and we had a good time. Like, we had 2 kids by then, and our son went to what do you call it?
English school?
No, he went to the first couple of years that you send a child kindergarten, or even before that. And our daughter was only about 2 years old. But then I got a call from UC Irvine, and they said, we're interested in what you're doing. We're interested in your dissertation. We'll fly you up, and we'll talk maybe about a job. So I flew up. I was there for three days or so. Met the dean, met grad students, met Department of Spanish, and sure enough, they offered me a job in 1974. So, and I've been there ever since. And it was a great decision. I really like the university, and I'm really happy with where we're at now.
That's great, wonderful, and we're going to have a great dialogue after the film, but what I'm going to have is Alejandro say a little bit about the film for everybody.
Okay. Well, the film is, what would say, about seven years, it's been 7 years, 8 years that we made the film. I had the idea of I had already written the novel. The novel was already out. The novel was first. And I did a lot of research for the novel, interviewed people for the novel, et cetera, et cetera. But then my daughter, who was writing, she was writing some film scripts, et cetera, decided to say, she told me, let's make a movie out of it. You have already some interviews. Let's do something with it. So her friends, Mike Kirsch and Art Kirsch, all involved in film, they have made quite a few documentary films. They liked the idea, and we applied for a grant. Nobody would give us any money, so we got some funds eventually, and we started making the film. And then I was in Washington D.C. at the DC program of the University of California. It was a research center. So I was there as one of the professors. Every campus back then would send a professor to teach. So I was there, for one quarter, and luckily I ended up being there for three quarters. And we decided to make do the film. But I also got invited at that time to Commerce, and Simons was really, they say it was in Montebello, but it really wasn't. Montebello didn't want anything to do with Simons because they didn't want anything to do with the Mexicans who worked there, primarily all Mexicanos.
At the time, Montebello was white. I mean,
it was white. It was very racist in that. But I was invited to go to Commerce because that's where the brickyard was really located, in Commerce. And I wrote. They found out about the book. They read the book, so they invited us to go. And then they invited all the people that lived there who were still alive, and their families to meet at Commerce. And so we expected maybe 100 people might show up. So we took cameras. We piled in there with a bunch of cameras. We set them up, and then we also had a camera. Somebody was handling the camera, hand cameras. So we had two really good cameras. We had two, Mike Kirsch had some good people working for him. Art was there. I think Art was part of the panel. I was on the panel. Ray Ramirez was on the panel. And David Deverell, William Deverell, who wrote a beautiful book called Whitewashed Adobe. And in that book, he has a wonderful essay of the Simons Brickyard. So we interviewed there just so many people. They wanted to get interviewed, the old timers and so, as you see in the film. And from that, we said, well, look, we have all of this material. Let's start putting it together. And so I started doing some writing. Alessandra's doing some writing. Mike did some writing as well. We put the film together. We had the narration, everything going. We wanted to get a real big voice to do the narration. Some famous movie star and so, right? Well, they wanted too much money, so we said, forget that. And then my daughter just kind of stepped in. Alessandra stepped in and said, well, let me try it. So she started doing the narration, and she did a beautiful job. Plus, we didn't have to pay her anything.
Is that child labor? Just kidding.
But anything, so that's how the film came about, and we were very happy with it. We've shown the film in libraries. We showed it in schools. We showed in bookstores and so forth. But it was wonderful, and it really got me into film. And to make a long story short, I also have a film that a Spanish fellow who met me in Spain at a conference, who is a filmmaker, and he just came up to me and he says, Alejandro, I'm going to make a film about you one day. About 5-7 years later, he got a grant to come to UCI and spent a whole quarter with me, right, talking about my books. He read every single one of my books. And then he says, let's make a film now. We're going to make a film. Well, the books are written, he read it before. But he knew my work very well, and he started to make a film. I never expected it. And the film is entitled Inner Borderlines, America Through the Eyes of Alejandro Morales. And I just recently was on a Zoom presentation of the film at George Mason University. And at first I was a little worried about the film. But this time I heard it, and the people responded to it in different ways. But I think, finally I decided this is a hell of a good film that this guy did, with no budget. He did it all himself, right? And so that's how the book came about, and that's how the film came about.
Well, good. So I think what we should do is watch the film, the brick people, and then we'll come back and do this great dialogue. Ready? Here.
This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
When we think about the growth of Los Angeles coming out of the latter part of the 19th century through the years approaching the Great Depression, we don't usually think about brick. Los Angeles is not seen to be a brick city, but in fact, it owes much of its growth and the metropolitanization of the city to that simple building material.
Oh María, Madre mía, oh consuelo del mortal, ampararme y guiarme a la patria celestial, ampararme y
The Brick People
guiarme
chronicles
a la patria
Mexican migration of the first part of the 20th century. The brickyard at one time in the 20s was the largest brickyard in the world, producing, 600,000 to maybe a million brick a day. All that brick was used to construct the major buildings of LA and Pasadena and all the Southern California area. All the big entrepreneurs like Walter Ruby Simons would not have been successful if it wasn't for that labor, if it wasn't for, so hand in hand, they built, Los Angeles. Hand in hand, they built Southern California.
In the late 1880s, when adventurers and entrepreneurs were pushing west by the thousands, Walter Simons went to Los Angeles with his brother Joseph to buy land rich in clay deposits. This new land was to become an extension of the family's 100-year-old brickmaking business that had begun in Worcester, England, a century earlier. The brothers finally settled on a piece of land on Glenarm Street in Pasadena, near what would eventually become the Pasadena Freeway. In all, they would open 8 brickyards that over the next several decades would supply bricks, roofing, paving tiles, and chimney block for construction needs around the world.
Simon's yard number 3, which was their big one, was out in Montebello. It's seen by many people as ironic that there's virtually nothing left there today, but in fact, that's fairly typical of Los Angeles having essentially an amnesic quality to its past and an ineffable ability to cover up what once was. But when the Simons Brickyard was roaring through the 20s and even into the Great Depression period, it was seen to be the world's largest brickyard.
By the turn of the 20th century, brick became the primary building material in Southern California. It was the basic material in the construction of housing, commercial buildings, and the larger, taller buildings of downtown Los Angeles.
Los Angeles City Hall, the inner walls are full of Simon's brick. When they redid the City Hall just a few years ago, they had to deal with Simon's bricks. Many of the city libraries throughout Southern California are made out of Simon's brick. Police stations, government buildings were made with Simon's brick. As you walk around certain areas, you look down, there's Simon's brick.
In 1904, with business already booming, the Simons brothers decided to purchase approximately 345 acres rich in red clay deposits in southwest Los Angeles, bordering the city of Montebello. The next year, Simons Brick Company No. 3 was established. The Los Angeles area was fast developing. California was no longer the Wild West, but a settled land rich with investment opportunities. All that was required for entrepreneurs to achieve the economic dream was an idea, money, and labor. This was the formula followed by the Simons brothers, who relied on a first-generation Mexican immigrant labor force to enact their vision of building a successful brick empire. The brick people, those immigrants who came from Mexico to work at Simon's Brickyard number 3 literally and culturally laid the foundation for Los Angeles and many other great cities in California and beyond.
Migration has always been a part of our history of LA. And it seems that LA has always been kind of like a focal point or a center. People always going through, coming down from the north, from the south, going to the north, right? And also from the east, the migrations of, of the people who colonized, set up the colonies, first colonies in the United States. From the east, they came to the west. They kept coming west, and LA, Southern California was one of the sources.
There was a demand for labor. There was a lot of encouragement where people wrote to bring their relatives up here.
At the sort of beginning of the Simons history in Southern California, there really isn't a border in the Southwest. There's a demarcation on maps, but there's no enforcement whatsoever.
The few immigration agents there were not looking for Mexicans to come across the border. They were looking for Asians trying to circumvent either the Gentleman's Agreement or the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Signed into federal law in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was an example of congressional reaction to economic instability and social unrest that manifested itself as racial exclusion on a broad scale. It prohibited the immigration of any Chinese laborers into the United States until its repeal in 1943.
Beginning around 1917, the U.S. begins to enforce immigration controls in the Southwest, not to necessarily control Mexican migration, but as part of a broader concern about European migration. So restrictions that are imposed on European migrants that they have to be literate are sometimes imposed in the Southwest, many times aren't. All of these things change what had been a very open environment up until the first decade of the 1900s to one where there are intermittent restrictions. And the intermittent restrictions are important because they force people who had previously treated the border as something that could be crossed freely to something where they have to consider which side of the border they want to be on.
It's not until really the Border Patrol is created in 1924 that one really begins to see this enforcement. This is the time of the Great Spanish Revival. Better Homes and Gardens encouraged homemakers to go Mexican in terms of their home decor. In fact, at the sesquicentennial of the founding of Los Angeles in 1931, Los Angeles city operators were instructed to answer the phone, "Buenos dias, City of Los Angeles." Now, Buenos dias, City of Los Angeles seems very ironic when at the same time they're deporting people.
Walter Simons understood that running a 24-hour brick factory required a constant source of dedicated workers. He built a company town to support the non-stop production. As the company town grew, there was a need to ensure safety and order for the residents. Walter Simons appointed Henry Prado sheriff.
By all accounts, he wore a star on his chest. Some accounts have him with a gun on his hip. And he was a man who kept order within the yard for the company. And to this day, multiple generations later, the memories of Henry Prado are still quite profound, in part because he was seen to be a fairly fierce and oftentimes self-aggrandizing figure of social control.
As the live-in workforce grew, they became more and more reliant on what Simons provided for them.
The Simons Brickyard, as a company town, is a fairly standard one, I would suspect.
We had our food there. We had our job there. Our church. Everything was just a close community, just like you'd have an army base. It was our own little city.
There was a store they called the Cooperativa on Vail. It was a company store.
I think we used to pay the electricity bill. Each house had to pay it. But I think that rent we didn't pay. But the electricity we did. Water we didn't.
Simons was a very highly developed company town, while the other brickyards I don't think had huge company towns around them. People lived outside of the brickyard. They drove to the brickyard. They lived. I think that particular Simons Montebello in Montebello, Simons Brickyard number 3 was the only real company town that developed.
The people of Simons embraced celebration just as any community would. Walter's wife sponsored the Simons Brickyard Band, made up of the more musically inclined residents. In fact, the band obtained so much local notoriety that it was eventually invited to participate in the Rose Parade twice. Walter Simons even expressed a flair for the theatrical, building an entertainment hall for his workers.
And he had a small dance room, and he had pool tables for the men to enjoy on the weekends to go play pool.
In 1913, Simons residents constructed Mount Carmel Catholic Church with bricks donated by the company. Father Charles Espelette dedicated his life to Simons. A beloved and indispensable member of the community, he oversaw baptisms, confirmations, and weddings in the community for most of his life.
We were born all in the house. One doctor, Dr. Hoffer, and he named all of us Carmen Maria, Virginia Maria, Francisca Maria. He liked Maria because he put us all in Marias. We were all Marias.
The town also encouraged the organization of a men's baseball team and a women's softball team. It has been said that some games became so heated that bricks were thrown. The baseball team produced several notable players, including Fred Haney, the future general manager of the California Angels.
It's one thing to think you can explain Simons through research, reading old documents, examining old pictures, etc. It's an entire other operation to try to understand Simons through the memories of the people who lived it.
Simons, you had to live in it to appreciate it.
It was a time of depression, so some people needed housing, and it was the lowest rent that they could afford, especially since a lot of fathers had no jobs other than the brick people. They had their jobs.
I think we had a nice group. People were nice because at that time, the people that used to live in Simons, either related or compadres. Everybody knew each other. Most of them came from the same place in Mexico.
Simons was a second Mexico.
Just like a big whole family, you know. Most of them, you know, the parents came from the same town in Mexico, Guanajuato.
Brickmaking was a dangerous and difficult job. The men labored hard every day, risking their health, breathing the fine red dust that filled the air, and enduring heat that for most would be intolerable.
And certainly compared to what else was available in the labor market at the time, yes, it was a good job. Was it a perfect job? Absolutely not. It was a hazardous job. It was a dirty job.
The production of brick from clay is a multi-pronged operation that moves from literally digging the clay out of the earth into a whole series of shaping and forming and drying and cooking the brick.
A lot of it was manual. That's why they needed a lot of cheap labor, immigrant labor.
Magdalena Baltazar was one of the laborers who supported his family with the money he earned making bricks.
A big steam shovel is loading the soil into those little carts. They dump them on a big, like a belt, and bring the soil into the machine. They like a pusher. You keep pushing the soil forward towards the press. So the press keeps going up and down. Every time it goes down, they'll have a mold, and then the press will push the soil into the mold, and then there'll be our men out there taking the pellets and put them up on the racks.
In the last summer of my high school, I went to work there also on what they call arracas, which is the racks where you get the pallet with about 6 wet bricks, and you try to grab them, and they have shelves where you try to put them down, and there was a guy behind me named Henry Zabala, and I couldn't do it. I was so weak then at that time. So I let him go to him, and after a while he shouted, "Hey, get somebody else. This guy can't do it."
I used to work there turning those bricks, and I think it was we used to get paid something like $2 or $3 to do a whole rack, what they used to call the racas.
All I remember was my dad making us go over there. We used to have to go follow him over to the big racks where they had all the bricks, and we'd just follow him. He'd be turning, we'd be turning. you know, until he got his section or whatever he was in charge of done, and then we could go play.
And then they set them there for about 2 or 3 days until they dry up. They load them up on little trucks. The mules pull them out to the kiln to be fired. When I was a kid, a lot of the bricks would melt. They didn't know how to adjust the heat, I guess.
There were piles all over the place, just everywhere.
But then they learned something, because later on, most of the bricks were same color as uniform. No waste. The only waste was when they break, when they fall.
I worked there like an animal. Winters, summers. The winter is all muddy. You know, but I mean, you like it, because those years, you live happily, you live there, I mean, with your relatives and friends and all that.
There was a lot of work to do in Simons other than just making bricks, and men were just half the story.
They worked hard under hazardous, exploitive conditions. Yet women had their place in Simons as well. You know, women built the community.
Women were the unrecognized labor that held the families and community together. They were their children's first teachers, passing on cultural values and generational traditions.
Oh, they worked. They had no hot water, so they had to boil the water to bathe us, to cook, to wash. Of course, they used scrub boards, of which I still have one.
We had chickens. Mother used to make those chickens in mole, in soup and everything. Rabbits. We had a lot to eat.
Women played an extremely vital role at Simons Brickyard. They volunteered in the school. They worked for the church. They probably organized the social events.
And some people had boarders that lived in a room, rented a room, or a young relative that lived with the family. And they would make lunches for these people. As they went to work, they would pack out their lunches. And when they came home, some of these women also sold lunches out of their homes.
One could diminish their reliance on the company store if they raised their own vegetables, if they had, chickens, if they had their own sort of domestic economy.
The mama had to keep things together. The mama was the lady that made clothes, patched the clothes. A lot of times people made clothing out of sacks, flour sacks. The mothers had to do all the cooking. It wasn't like today when you get a microwave and pop stuff in. They actually had to grow some of the crops out in the backyard.
Historians have said that it's the women, sort of hold the glue that keeps the Mexican-American family together.
Simons encouraged the workers to grow their own population by setting up the Simons Company bonus baby program. Every baby born earned the family a $5 gold piece.
But of course, there's different ways to look at this. Paying, in essence, families that have children is perhaps also a way to build loyalty and build the birth rate to eventually have more workers in that brickyard. And so that's a classic kind of benevolent view that's tinged with the needs of the brickyard in terms of labor.
Domestic economies helped to provide a feeling of wealth to many financially unwealthy families.
We weren't wealthy, but I think our wealth came in a different way, where we were a very close family. We believe in God, and I think we're pretty happy.
There was a saying that my mother used: we were poor, but we were clean. They didn't think of it as being a bad situation.
The depression didn't bother us. No bother.
And everybody was in the same boat. They all had the same homes, or we call them shacks now, but they were homes then for us.
So that was the beauty of growing up in Simons. We were poor, but didn't know it, and we enjoyed every bit of it.
Despite the brickyard's economic success and seemingly utopian company town community, it stands as one of America's greatest examples of segregation and oppression.
The Simons Brickyard story is on the one hand, a case study of the rise of Los Angeles in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the ways in which that rise is fundamentally related to race relations.
Although many Simons residents remember life in Simons as a positive and happy time, they still had to deal with direct and de facto discrimination and racism.
Life outside that brickyard was harsh and racially antagonistic.
There are segregated theaters. There are segregated pools, even playgrounds.
All Simons residents had to attend Vail, the Mexican school.
I remember getting wrapped over my knuckles with a ruler for speaking Spanish.
You couldn't speak a word of Spanish. Every so often, I used to do it, and I would be sitting on the bench. Go to the office, somebody reported me, of course, and I would sit, and now you are required to take Spanish. If you have a job and you're bilingual, good for you. If you don't have a job. Isn't it something? And I used to be sitting on the bench there because somebody snitched on me that I said something in Spanish.
Simon students were profiled exclusively as workers in training with no other possibilities for advancement.
The school that they had was not to prepare young men and women to go off to college or to go off into a trade.
Those students who went on with their schooling were automatically placed in shop and home economics classes.
It was to be, a literate worker in the factory.
More overt versions of the racism and discrimination prevalent in schools were also practiced aggressively in the community of Montebello.
They didn't sell houses in Montebello to Mexicans.
When people, when you were walking by, they look at you as though you stink or something.
If you went to certain restaurants, they would have signs, no dogs or Mexicans allowed. My aunt worked in Uptown Whittier at the Penn Hotel. She was a maid, but she couldn't stay at the Penn Hotel because they had a sign, no Mexicans or dogs allowed.
Prevailing discriminatory attitudes outside of Simons and other Mexican communities kept Los Angeles heavily segregated for many years. Mexicans couldn't use the public swimming pool except on special Mexican days.
Well, locally, if they went swimming at Montebello, there was only certain days where the Mexicans could go swimming.
But I'm going to tell you a little story. There was a plunge in Montebello, and people for Simons were not allowed to go there, use it. So the older fellows, they would go get as red as they could from the dust, from the brick, from the molino. And at night, they would go jump the fence at the plunge and leave that blue water red. And they couldn't figure how they had jumped because that fence was high, but the guys found our way. And they would sneak in there and swim and leave the water nice and red for them.
Today, if you look at it, what we know today, we wouldn't call it an ideal place to live or an ideal situation for a worker. I think World War II changed that. World War II broke out, and the men from Simons went to war.
The men of Simons, the young fellows of Simons went and participated in the war, just like many, many, many other Mexicanos and Latinos did. And they did it proudly.
The men came back from war having experienced new worlds and new ways of being. They had lived lives of change and were ready to continue doing so.
As the young men that went off to war came back, they had been exposed to things that were different. And they saw that as being time for a change.
But during the war, it changed everything. People got, well, something else too that happened that improved relations with the people. During the Depression, the government started putting out jobs for the men, for the people. They used to call it WPA. And they used to have people digging dishes, maybe 300-400 people digging one dish. And they had all kinds of people, black, white, anything. So people got to get used to mixing together. But I think that's where the integrating started, for people working together.
The Long Beach earthquake of 1933 had a profound impact on the brick business in greater Los Angeles. Simons tries to stay ahead of this, Walter Simons, and perhaps some of his employees, by trying to manufacture a brick that is earthquake resistant. So they start to throw iron bars in the middle of the bricks to reinforce them. Seems like a reasonably good idea. So it's essentially rebar through brick. But nonetheless, the brick industry had taken a real blow. Also, the Simons company had proven somewhat unable or unwilling to diversify management. And so the Simons family is still in charge as the principals, particularly Walter Roby Simons, age. And perhaps had they made other management decisions, the brickyard may have been able to withstand its eventual collapse a bit longer. By the early 1950s, the handwriting's clearly on the wall that the Simons Brick Company is failing. And certainly by the mid-1950s, after Walter Simons has been removed from the scene by death, the Simons Brickyard is sputtering along.
As he got sick and he was put into a sanitarium, there was really nobody taking care of the plant. Things were being run by his wife as best she could. But eventually the county health department came in and declared the housing as substandard. And people eventually moved out. And then there was a group of industrialists backed up by the Santa Fe Railway called the Central Manufacturing District. And they bought the property from the estate. And then it was subdivided down and made into an industrial area. And none of the street names that coincide with Simons are there anymore. You have different street names, so people can't relate to that unless you grew up in the area and know some of the history. The only place you'll see the name Simons is either on a brick or on the Simons underpass on the 5 Freeway.
The sheer power of the Simons Brickyard, which in fact paid fairly well, given the labor economics of the day, meant that many, many Mexican origin families had some relation to the Simons Brickyard.
Simons Brickyard number 3 at Simons, California, represents a chapter of California history that is all but lost, except in the memories of those who lived and worked there. To remember and retell the story of Simons is to pay homage to the many lifetimes of labor that contributed to the physical structure and communal foundation of 21st century American society.
These stories show us that we're not so different after all. We all go through the same kind of situations, right? Live the same ways, have many of the same problems. Right? That we're all really one huge, in a sense, familia.
I think it's history, and I think it should be told how these people came and work here and contribute to this country.
It's not only the bricks, the legacies are in the buildings, but also in the generations of the descendants of the brick people.
To me, it's like a detective story. It's like a mystery. You're trying to solve this mystery. It's almost like a puzzle. You're trying to put all the pieces together. And there's so much raw material that it's out there. And you're trying to refine this into a story. And a story that hasn't been told.
Oh María, Madre mía, oh consuelo del mortal, ampararme y guiarme a la patria celestial, ampararme y guiarme a la patria celestial. Con el ángel de María, las grandezas celebrar, transportados de alegría, sus finezas publicar.
Thank you. That was a great, really important film on the Simons brick factory. But before we open it up, Alejandro and Margarita, I just want to mention two things to me personally, the importance of it. One is my barrio was just above Montebello. South San Gabriel. It was unincorporated. It was Las Lomas, that's what we called it. And so I know the area, and so I relate to all this. Montebello by then, when I moved there, was majority Mexican, because by then they started opening up, the segregated area started changing. But that's important for me. The other thing that's important is that I worked, LA was the largest manufacturing center of the whole country. People think it's Chicago, Detroit, or those people had a lot of manufacturing, but LA had more than any other city. And so Simons was part of that manufacturing history that I think people need to know, because Mexicans came out in large numbers to work in this industry. This is why we have the largest Mexican population of any other city. They came to work, which whether it was garment, whether it was aerospace, whether it was shipyards, whatever it was. I worked in that industry for 10 years, and I worked in the Bethlehem Steel, where it used to be on Slauson, and I worked in lumber, the other industry. And then this area, Northeast Valley, brought a lot of Mexican migrants here because there was a brass foundry in Pacoima, Price Pfister. There was not far from here the GM plant at Panorama City, which was big. There was aerospace, there was garment. There's a lot of, all these areas where Mexicans have settled in, industry brought them in. So Simons is a great part of that story. So I want to mention those two things. But Alejandro and Margarita, I want you to talk a little bit about why this is important to know, because I think people, the statement of one of the people was that we have this amnesia. We forget who we are, how we got here. It's almost like by magic we're here. We need to know those stories.
Yeah. Do we start? Well, it's not. It's just to change one word in your statement. You said we have amnesia. It's not us who has the amnesia.
No.
Right. Yeah. It's all the scholars, all the people in the newspapers, all the journalists, et cetera, et cetera.
Media and
They completely ignore
the historians.
Our historians, especially our history. They don't really give it any credit. And you're very right. You're correct in saying that so many Mexicans came to this country, as the immigration situation was. My father, he just crossed the border, crossed the bridge in El Paso, paid for the use of the bridge, and got his green card. So I mean, that's how easy it was to get into the United States. So many people, especially during the Mexican Revolution, which the book also talks about that. Yes. They came. My parents, they were both born in Mexico, but their families were afraid of the rurales. For example, they were running the Porfirio Diaz rurales, and they were taking advantage of them as laborers, et cetera, and so they wanted to get out of there. And they knew that the war was going to settle around, the Guanajuato and Michoacan. All the big battles were fought in that area. Right? Aguascalientes and so forth. So people knew it was going to get ugly, because of this, and so they started going north. And what happened to some of the families, I think, which is an interesting thing also, is that they already had relatives living in Los Angeles even before the war, and they already, because Simons was founded in 1905, right? And so they had families living there, so they started going to where they would be received with family. So they started heading up there, and it was a kind of a chain migration that started all from Guanajuato, Michoacan, all these areas, and so frankly, all my uncles, all my great uncles ended up in Simons. If you go, I noticed that you were reacting to the photos, because my dad is there, my grandfather is there, I have uncles there that I could point out to you. But it was, and Simons was so powerful. They didn't have just one; they had 7 brickyards, and one of them was real close to in Pasadena. Okay. Right. So, and they were producing 500,000 to 1 million brick per day. And all that brick was sent, all over Southern California, to the north. And when the earthquake hit San Francisco, tons and tons of brick was sent up there. Yeah. And so it definitely was, a great contributor to the development of Southern California, LA, especially, but the whole United States. And the other thing that was not clear there was that the Simons brothers were also their parents were immigrants. They came from England, and they had a brick factory in England. So the dad and his family came, and then the kids were born here, but they knew the business, you know, and so they started in Iowa, and I was at, you know, I told you I was at the DC program in Washington DC, you know, from UC, and there was a restaurant right next to us, right, and so, and they had a wall of Simon, I mean a wall of bricks, but then I got a little closer and it was Simon's brick.
Wow.
So you find Simon's all over the country, and Simon's bricks all over the country. You know, so it was definitely you know, real strong, important. You know, and then Mr. Simons, obviously they're very wealthy. You know, he became very wealthy. Joseph Simons became very wealthy. They had another brother who passed away, but you know, they were a real powerful family, and he became sort of the what is it, the president of the Los Angeles Brick Association or something like that. But he wasn't the only brick maker. There was, if you look, you have LA Brick, you have all sorts of different companies, much smaller, still producing brick and selling. They all survived, because brick was the building material in the 1920s and 30s, and after the earthquake, as was noted, you know, it went down and became just a decorative item, basically. You know, the other thing though, one last thing is, all the chimneys, the huge, I have a huge chimney.
I got one too. I bet you Sam's
Sam-
brick. I'm gonna look.
I have
I'm gonna
some.
look.
One last thing I'll say here. The Huntington Library,
Yeah.
you know, I'm a reader there, and I do a lot of work in the Huntington. Mr. Huntington, right, all those buildings he has there, I bet you, a lot of Simon's Brick is in there. And I talked to William Deverall, who was here, who was in the film, and I sent him a letter, says, I want to do something about the Huntingtons, you know, maybe do a film about Mr. Huntington, right? And not necessarily a comparison, but it would be a comparison of the way he treated his Mexican labor, and comparing the Simons, the Simons brothers, especially Walter, right? So there's a lot of possibilities there. You know, I can go on and on and on, but let me just say one more thing.
Go ahead.
And the question of academics and academicians writing about us, and a lot of them, you know, ignore us completely, right, in their histories. You know, that's, and the point is, who can write history? You know, most people think, well, I'm not a historian, so therefore, you know, I can't write anything about my family. I can't write I'm not a writer. I can't write about my mom and dad and so on. But that's not the case at all. There's another type of history that is becoming more and more popular, and universities are recognizing it today and developing programs around it, and that's public history. And public history is not generated by you know, people who are highly educated, et cetera, it's generated by the common folk. No, la intrahistoria, the intrahistory, is written by the common folk, because why? They are the key to all these men's success. You know, that labor is the key to, you know, the success and the building of Los Angeles. So I really urge people. I like to talk about them write about their life, write about their mother and father, write about where they worked, how they worked. That is public history. And the first place you can start, if I can remember this, is Tustin Historical Society. That's just the name of the area that we live at. They have all sorts of things going back to, you know, the turn of the century that people have donated. There's where you start. If you live in Pacoima, if you live in Silmar, whatever, go to probably some kind of a historical society of the area. You'll probably find treasures there. You know, so it's not just the highly educated people who write history. It is also the common folk that can write history.
I'd like to comment not only on the writing of the history, but on the awareness of the history. One of the reasons why I changed careers from engineering, Rockwell, to teaching at the university level was to bring awareness to our people through literature and language. And as a professor at different universities, I instilled that into all of my students to bring in their histories and write about them and publish them as undergrad students, not necessarily grad students. And especially the last university where I worked at Channel Islands, there was no means for students to write that history. So I was fortunate to have, I would say, at least 70% of the students were of Mexican descent, Mixtecos, and many of them did not know Spanish, so they were taking my courses to learn Spanish and also to learn other ways to communicate. So I founded I call it Revista Literaria, a creative literary journal in which not only the students but also the community could bring in their personal experiences. In we published 4 numbers for different years before I retired, and there's nothing but chronicling their lives, and just like the books that Alejandro publishes, not only the Brick People, the River of Angels, in which there's so much history of Los Angeles. So in 5, 10, 20 years, when they look at those journals, the students and their relatives and their children that come afterwards will also be or know of the history of their families and how they contributed to the building, whether of Oxnard, Pacoima, Los Angeles, Montebello, all of these places. So that has been one of the biggest, for me, biggest rewards in teaching, to be able to not only bring awareness to students through literature, this kind of literature, but also for them to be motivated and know that they can also make their own history or write their own history.
And let me point out that Tia Chucha's is a bookstore, and we do have Alejandro Morales' books here, so you can actually order them online. So go to tiachucha.org/bookstore, and you can look at all his books that are going to be there, but we'll also have them here. Please come to our bookstore, because it's the only bookstore for 500,000 people here in the Northeast Valley, the only one. And so that's where our stories get told, and that's where people like Mr. Morales' works need to be out there because of this history. There's 2 other things that I wanted to mention. The Mexican Revolution, the importance of it, because I did a lot of study of it myself on my own. I'm not an academic in that sense. I'm an academic, like you'd say. I just study on my own. And 1 million people died during the revolution, might have been even more, but 1 million refugees. This is when Mexico only had 15 million people. That's the size of Guatemala today. That's a big, devastating war. My family was involved. My grandparents one fought for Villa, and they one fought for Carranza, 2 enemies actually, but they were fought in the war. My dad grew up during the war and would never talk about it because he witnessed things. He was born in 1911, the war started in 1910. So by the time he was 7 or 8 years old, they were still killing people. He witnessed, one thing he told me, he witnessed a machetazo, some guy being killed with machetes, which it's one of the worst things you can ever do to anybody, And he was like 7 or 8 years old when he witnesses. One story he told, he doesn't talk about it. I think it's important, the Mexican Revolution, because that populated, especially the Southwest, but even cities like Chicago, because I lived in Chicago, and all the Mexicans that went up, it populated a lot of areas, people leaving during the war, and like you're saying, there was families and people here. The other thing that I found interesting in the film was when people were talking about the segregation, this area somewhere, not long ago, had those kind of, this used to be all white too, and it had those signs, no Mexicans and dogs allowed. And so we all went through that.
Yes, we have.
And then when there was white flight, a lot of them left. The Mexicans that were working, that could own a home or afford it, moved in here. It's a working class area here. But people need to know the history of the woman that said she couldn't speak Spanish. I'm still part of that generation.
So am I.
In Watts, where I got slapped by a teacher when I was 6 years old for speaking Spanish in the classroom, slapped across in front of the whole kids. These are things that impact you tremendously, and we went through that. And so I think those histories, those stories have to be told so that we don't ever relive them, so that we don't ever go back to a time like that. Some the young kids now speak Spanish and English, they're better at it. We had a struggle because we were told not to speak Spanish, and I think that's people need to know. So I want you to talk about a little bit more about the writing, because for you, I think it's very important that you got this research. You were able to do a novel, but it was also based on a lot of fact and research. Maybe you can talk about what that entails. What does that do for a story?
Well, it makes it richer, absolutely. It makes it really kind of stand up, I think. But that's the way I work, and it's, let's see, historiographic metafiction. Historiographic metafiction, probably not, you heard of that term. It's a literary term, it's a theoretical term, about, written again by academicians and so forth, people scholars who have tried to find differences in the literature that's being produced today by either ethnic groups or different kinds of writers are coming up. And historiographic metafiction means historiographic is history, and graphic means writing history. Metafiction, right? Meta is the Greek term for beyond, right? And fiction is about writing fiction, right? Literary writing. But what it's also saying is that writers today should go beyond history. In other words, I don't believe in historians. I don't think that anything is caught in writing is truthful. It is interpretation. All things are interpreted from the time you, forgive me for saying this, but when the doctor talks to you, he's looked at certain documents and tests. What does he do? Or she do? She interprets those, right? We're following certain guidelines. But it's still an interpretation. So all experience is interpretation. So this is the key, what motivates me to write. And what it means, this whole term means, you challenge history. You challenge what has been written, et cetera, et cetera.
Very powerful.
I got learned very early. It's his story.
Yeah.
Or, that's exactly what you mentioned. His story about history. The way I was taught that very early. I'm sorry.
Right. But that's actually right.
His story
that fits so well with Dr. Morales just said.
Yeah, the history of white people, the history of the power brokers, the people, men, the story of people that ruled this land when it wasn't for them to rule. It wasn't meant for them to rule. That I think is what we're talking about. And so many ways, like you're saying, history that people say, well, this is all fact, is actually fiction.
It is.
It's fiction.
A lot of it is fiction.
Yeah.
Because historians, there's I think I can't think of his name right now, but it's called metafiction. I think the title of the book. Hastings, I forget his last name is White, I think. Right? Hayden White. Well, he says he takes all the historians that everybody are the great historians of our time and in the 19th century, right? And he shows you how some of these historians have tremendous amount of information for point A of their book, right? And then he has to get to point C of the book. But in between, he has nothing. But yet he has to cover that part of history. So the middle part between A and C becomes even a more of an interpretation, because he really has to do a heck of a lot of research. But nonetheless, the whole book, Metafiction, shows you the whole book, including Hayden White's book. It's an interpretation of how we see, historians and how we believe in historians. Yet they are also fiction writers.
Your point, I think, also it's pertinent now because people are fighting in the school boards now about history, and they're fighting against the new multiracial diversity. They're going against critical race theory. They're going crazy when you're bringing in racism as endemic to the system. They're going nuts, but they don't accept the fact that what you pointed out, everything that's historical is actually, most of it's made up. They can get facts in there, but they're facts taken out of context, and they make up a history. It's all fantasized about the discoverers, the people that founded the land. They fantasize about who they are, the idea that it's white people that created culture. This is the way I get from. They're still taught in our schools,
I had a professor at Loyola, Dr. Jimenez. I don't know if you knew back in the 70s, and he was so critical that the Caucasian students in the class were always offended by him. He would come back and say, look, this is your history that we have been taught. And exactly what you're advertising right now is so dramatic. What I remember him teaching to us back then. It's like, I was reliving it right now.
There's also the element of language and exclusiveness of a language. And Alejandro, your novels are in many ways bilingual, but and I would say not only bilingual, but they bring in a lot of culture with the expressions that you choose in Spanish as well. I know the novels, some of the novels are translated into Spanish, but some other works include already certain expressions in Spanish. And like we saw in the documentary, and you mentioned as well, we are part of those generations that were forbidden to, or were punished for speaking Spanish, regardless of what we said, just to communicate. And I consider that it is important that Spanish does not get excluded, because it brings in so much meaning to a culture that is trying to be, or that is becoming more and more obsolete and deleted, even by many Chicano writers that do not include any Spanish or are not even exposed to that. So because of the market, because of different reasons, maybe lack of exposure, but it is great that we still have that. Because the migration continues, and how will these students, how will these young people learn this literature if it's not, is it until they learn English? Is it until they learn this new language? They don't have to. I don't think so.
Yeah, I think you're right. And also, demographics is changing radically in this country, as you well know. You know, I don't know, right now we have, what is it, 335 million people, 337 million people. A large, you know, the percentage for the Latinos or the Latino population, Latinx population if you want, you know, right now it's what, close to 70 million people. You know, and you can look at different research sites, and you'll find that population is booming, and in the years to come it's going to continue to boom, right? So I think that definitely Spanish is going to be a key issue, you know, as far as, you know, speaking Spanish and not losing the language, et cetera, et cetera. But that's kind of exciting, and it's also to many people very threatening. That's why a lot of people, you know, for example, California is now a majority minority state, and some people are afraid that the United States is going to become a minority majority country, and that's probably, you know, maybe not in our time, probably it just might happen. You know, one last thing about what I'm doing now is I was invited to go to the University of New Mexico, and they read one of my books, which is here, if you want it, The Ragdoll Plagues. And it's a little book, and it has part one that takes place during the conquest of Mexico, right? And part two takes place, and a great illness hits during that time. And then part two is the year 1979, when a great illness hits Los Angeles. That's AIDS, right? And then I decided to just go way into the future, right? The year 2079 or 20, I forgot what exactly it was, right? But that and a lot of the people who are writing about my works today are looking at that and some of my other works and trying to find statements, which I do make, or characters or situations which show the future, are beginning to deal with the future. So they invited me to talk about, of all things, which I'm not an expert at all at that, futurism. And that's a big thing coming on in the arts, in literature, in film, in comic books, et cetera, futurism is what they wanted me to talk about. And I had a wonderful time. I was there for about 3 days, and it was great talking to the students because they responded, right? And then I gave another talk for, I think it was a room this big, you know, and at the oldest building in the University of New Mexico. Beautiful building with a big old giant oval you know, table. Everybody was around it, and then more and more people brought in chairs to listen. But I talked about my vision of the future. My vision of Mexico and the United States, the borderlands, my vision of the borderlands in the future. And they're radically different it is, you know, radically different from what most people think. And they all think what? In a very negative way. And one guy says, well, why about all these terrible things that are happening? You know, why didn't you talk about that? And I say, well, heck, you see it on TV every day.
Every day.
You know, come on. What's wrong with thinking utopian about the future? And I believe that the relationship between Mexico and the United States is radically going to change, right? And so things are going to get better, even south, 300-400 miles south of the borderlines, all those cities, all Chihuahua, Hermosillo, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be a radical difference. So I'm really positive about the future. So I guess my statement here is I'm going to be writing more and more and more about the future.
And let's just say that imagination begins to carry more of the truths than some of the so-called truths that people claim in these books. Being imaginative now, I think, is very important.
Absolutely.
And especially about what the future holds, especially what stories can be told, how we tell these stories.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you for that. It's very important. By the way, again, we got books here, his books, Alejandro Morales. You can order them online. You can come to the bookstore. We also, and I don't mind announcing, Tia Chucha Press is very proud to be doing his next novel. Right. It'll be out this the fall of 2023. The White Heron.
The Place of the White Heron.
Place of the White Heron is the name of it. We are going to do it. We're proud of it. When we get it out there, we'll get the word out. We'll spread it out. We want people to get his latest book. So this is a very honor for us. But the other thing I want to mention, which I think is important, is the role of Mexicans and other neighbors, but especially Mexicans, talking about it, in creating these communities. My wife was telling me the story that when she was going to see son, her dad drove her one day to the school, and he pointed out, I built that building. I built that building. She was totally surprised. You built that building? She thought she was entering a world that wasn't for her. She grew up in Pocoyo.
Right.
And now she's entering this is the white man's world, it's another world, but it really was a world that Mexicans helped create. And of course, her dad couldn't go to that school, and for a long time, Mexicans weren't allowed in San Fernando Valley State for the longest time. But she was part of that generation, like Margarita, that opened those doors, and Alejandro, who played a role in opening those doors. We were building the buildings, the Huntington Library, that it was built by Mexicans, and yet we never give it credit. So I think what's important is to point out you don't want to tell the story of only the ones that owned the buildings and owned the land and put the money. You want to tell the story of the people that actually labored to make it happen.
And that's that amnesia that's happening, right? The Huntingtons don't want to. Huntington, I don't think ever recognized the Mexicans. And I looked through, did research there, and I looked through the way they were paid. And you look at the pay scales that we got. You know, some fellow by the name of Smith got, let's say, to make up a number, $100. Morales got maybe 35 to 25, you know, $50 at the max.
Yeah.
And one last thing about Huntington, there's I have to quote this. I forgot where I got the quote, but Huntington, to build his railroads, right, brought in, according to this scholar or whatever, 1,000 Mexicans to build all his railroad, and he paid them less than a penny a mile. And so.
No, those are important.
So you know, that's a documentary I want to make.
Yeah, but Huntington's name is on the streets.
Yeah.
It's a name of different communities.
On the cities.
But you don't see the names of the people that actually made it happen. This is why the stories are important. And this is why.
There's a scholar, I think it's Isabel Molina. Is it Molina?
Right.
Yeah. And she writes a lot about her family, right? But she interviewed, in this article that came out in the LA Times that panned Huntington, right? But she interviewed her father, and she took him to the Huntington Gardens, and she said, Mika, you know, we built this.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? We built this place. So, you know, it's hidden history is just there. We just got to dig it up and find it.
So this is why we have to tell these stories. I'm not sure how much time we have, but we're doing good? Okay. So is there anything else you want to add? 'Cause again, I think what this opens up is that we have a role, all of us, and especially our young people, to begin to tell these stories. And be imaginative, but let the truth come through the imagination. And to challenge the made-up fantasized stories that we see in our schools, because they're still there. I just saw a history book recently. Somebody sent it to me. It's the same BS that they've always been telling. They haven't changed the story. This is not even true. Let's open up that world where the truth can come out, even if it's done through the imagination, but make sure that truth is what's pushing through our works.
I agree with that. Yeah, so.
I'll say that there's history that's being written, and when we think of the borderlands, it's not just Mexican or a Mexican population crossing over. We hear in the news many of the people from Nicaragua, from Central America, that live in Mexico and are, for example, in Texas, over 1,000 or 1,500 people crossing every day, and most of these people are from Nicaragua, from Central America. And there's so much of that, of course, for example, we think of the areas or the borderland that expands in the ragdoll plagues, for example, in your novel. But those histories are in here as well.
Yeah.
So we have a different, not an exclusively Chicano, Mexicano neighborhood. There's so many more that also look at the Chicano history, the Mexican history, whether through the revolution, through Spanish, through the histories that you're writing, but they also have commonalities with of course, everywhere, especially in the valley. Everywhere we go, we can find it.
There is no barrio
No.
in LA area, probably in other parts, that is not Mexican and Central American. And so I always say that now because I want people to know that Mexican Central America, East LA used to be all Mexican, a lot of Central America. There is no neighborhood now where we can't say there's not Central American.
Correct.
There's also a lot of indigenous students now
Yeah,
coming to the university.
Zapotecos, Mixtecos, as he's pointing out, from Oaxaca.
I went to a meeting of these new students that are coming in, and they're indigenous students. They identify as indigenous. They speak 3 languages. Some of them do. They speak their native language, Spanish and English. But there's more and more and more of those students that are coming in to the universities. In fact, we just hired a fellow who was a specialist in indigenous history, indigenous literature, and so forth.
There was a new survey they did of Mexico because they always downplay the indigenous people, but they found out that there's 27 million still indigenous speaking first language peoples in Mexico.
Yes.
That's more than any other country in the Americas, even though per capita Guatemala has more indigenous and Peru might have more indigenous. But as far as numbers, Mexico still has its largest but first primary languages still. 27 million is quite a lot, but they always diminish that number. They always say that as far as they claim that everybody's mestizos, which is not really true, because the Spanish, there weren't that many Spanish to marry everybody and everything, so they just de-Indianize all the people. They just made them all mestizos when many were not even Spanish. But I know because my family's from Chihuahua, and there's a lot of Tarahumara, but I also know that a lot of Tarahumaras that became de-Indianized just said we were Mexicans and became mestizos. They were mestizos, but they became mestizos because that's the cool thing. That's what gives you place. Hey, I'm mestizo.
In Mexico, during the colonial period, the church developed a caste system, and and they were so hybrid by then. Because one of the differences in how they colonized the United States from Europe, and then how the Spaniards colonized Mexico and Latin America. One of them is that the northern colonizers from, let's say, northern Europe, they brought their families. The people who came to the New World through Spain didn't bring families; they're mostly men at the beginning. So what did they look? They looked for indigenous women. So right away, hybridization, started and continued even more and more. So Spain, because that was racist church, said, well, we have to control our purity of blood. You know, so therefore they started naming all these different castes.
Yeah, like a
Naming
casta
them-
system.
Casta
yeah,
system, yes.
Mestizo, Sambo.
Yeah. Even Cholo's in there. Cholo, which
Right.
we use in the streets, is in there too.
So there are
Different.
about 60 to
Mulatto,
90
yeah,
plus.
yeah.
90 plus
90
castes
plus.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
they try to control.
So people, yeah, they need to know that history. So I think we're at the very end of this, right? We're getting close. So let's just again point out Alejandro Morales has gotten all his books here, and we can get them online. We've got all his novels and all his other books that are here. And we are, Tia Chucha Press, in the fall of 2023, will be presenting his newest book, his newest novel, In the Place of White Herons.
The Place of the
Place
White
of
Heron.
White Heron. So we want to make sure that we get that word out, and when that happens, we'll spread it out. Alejandro Morales is a treasure in our community. I'm so glad that he's here with us. I'm so glad that he can still be able to share what he knows, and especially the things that I love, which is the East Side, which I'm originally from, even though now I'm a Valley guy.
Yes.
But the other side of it is too that you're about the working class, the poor, the laboring classes, which people forget. Our stories need to be told from that viewpoint as well.
If I may just say, just thank you guys for coming, and I really enjoyed it, and thank Margarita also.
I truly enjoyed it.
Yes, she's been working with me. Sorry, she's an excellent
Since I retired.
both in Spanish and in English. She's an excellent editor, top editor.
Well, thank you.
By the way, if you buy a book, you can take a copy of the film.
Oh, cool. There you go. That's good to know. There you go. So anybody can buy books will get a copy of the film, The Brick People. Thank you all very much, Margarita. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alejandro, thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro.
Maybe we'll do this. I think we're going to do this again, so we'll
Yes.
plan some other events. Thank you all very much. Spread the word. Buy these books and spread the word about his new book coming out in the fall.
If I may, also the next presentation that we're going to do is the book of poetry.
The poetry.
Yeah.
Zapote Tree.
Zapote Tree, because I came up with my first book of poetry this year.
Love that. All right. Thank you all.
Thank
Be
you.
well.